That is the most I've talked at once in a long time. All right, anybody have questions for me? Yes.
So when you talk about, the first thing that pops up in my head is last month in Idaho, with the woman being dragged out of the Republican town hall.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about Parrhesia, that is one of the first things that would pop up in my head. I'm not saying I'm really seeing a tide turn, but there seems to be a growing resistance to this, to what is going on with Felon 47, Department of Grift and Elon, and all that stuff. So we're working in a situation where nobody wants to play by the rules. So in this sense, how do we address this change when we're really kind of working in a, what's the word I want to use? Partially subjective, cruel, and insane environment?
Sure, that's a great question. One of the things that I think is happening is right now, a lot of the things that I talked about, we're talking about disrupting the status quo, but there is no status quo right now. It's like a lot of the things we're seeing are, I'm so tired of hearing the word unprecedented, but they are unprecedented. So welcome to unprecedented times. It's a good question. And I think some of actually what is happening right now, meaning the cruel disruptions that we're seeing, this is one of those things that I talk about. One of the reasons that there is a number of people who find it appealing is this very thing that we've not ever talked about called Parrhesia in our society is disruptive, it's blunt, it does things that people don't want you to do. And so without the tools to interrogate that, people are like, well, that's kind of what's happening, right? Like all of this stuff's going away and you people don't get any money and this, so there's a lot of things happening and it kind of mimics that. However, at the heart of that are things that are literally untrue. And part of what I talk about in the book is that while it is hard to, you can't say, well, I speak from the truth. Like, that's not a thing you can claim because they're like, whose truth? Who's doing? But there are tools to interrogate that truth. If something is literally factually incorrect, it's not true. Full stop. And then there are other things that go with that as well. But I think right now, people are very tired of feeling oppressed, and people don't know what to do about it. That is a lot of what I'm seeing. So like you mentioned the woman being pulled out. So part of what she did herself, she didn't really do anything terrible to begin with. Now, if somebody had stood up, and I cannot believe they didn't, but you see how everybody sat there and let that happen. Parrhesia means somebody stands up and says, you can't do that. You can't just arrest somebody for talking. That's Parrhesia. And then and I know this from having been a psych major, if one person stands up, it makes it way more likely for other people to stand up too. The whole bystander dynamic that happens when, if somebody is mugged on the street, if no one says anything, no one says anything. But if one person says, hey, stop it, you can't do that, then other people will join in. And Parrhesia is a lot like that.
Because where I see it, you say unprecedented, I see it more as complacency.
Yes.
It's disrupting our complacency, especially as white people. Because we as white people tend not to be very oppressed, especially folks like us, white guys, middle-aged white guys. So in that sense, it's a way of kind of disrupting that complacency among, let's say, my peers. What is a adequate tactic to use?
An adequate tactic to use?
So like, for instance, I'll give you, just so in a scenario like maybe, arguing with someone online who's like, Elon found $800 billion of fraud and this and that. They're getting, so I guess my question is, how do we battle the disinformation? That's
a whole other thing. I've been working on that. I have been working on like what is happening rhetorically with like conspiracy theories, like what is the appeal? I understand what the appeal is, but I don't have ways to counteract it. I know things that don't work. Agonistic rhetoric, telling them facts literally makes no difference whatsoever. And I would also argue that not that nothing that happens online can be Parrhesiastic, but very few things are, because there's not any real danger. Like the person's not in front of you, like it's a lot more risky to tell somebody you know, you hear somebody say something terrible and racist behind you, it's way harder to turn around and go, you can't say that to her. Like, that's harder than typing, you can't say that to her. And so I would also, there is that, like, it gets into like areas of activism versus slacktivism, and like what is real social action. And I don't have like, well, here's the answer to that. Let me give you a simple answer. I don't. But there are very, very few things, I think, that can be done in those situations. You can't make someone else change their mind. And I say that as like the PhD in rhetoric that I have in studying argumentation all the time. Yeah, you're welcome. Yes?
This is related to the discussion already, but as you were talking, I'm thinking, so is this act the act of an individual, a solo act, or can it be a group? Because then if it's a group, there's less risk and less danger.
Yes, that is one of the things that, like, wanted to go off in this book about. Could you turn this off for me? I can't hear questions as easily. Yes, I do believe, one, that groups can enact Parrhesia. One of the things I looked at some of the Black Lives Matter things, groups. You're absolutely right. It is harder to trace a person if they're in a group. And I do think that I have a whole theory of like how, of coalitions, and like how that are very fluid coalitions come together and then come apart. And that is kind of the next thing that I would actually like to do with this, because I think there is a model for group parrhesiastic action. And I think that even when it seems to be an individual, it's never an individual. It appears that way. It's one person who says that, but there are always other actors in that network. I have not found one purely individualistic, only working on their own act of parrhesia in all of the research that I did. So there are always people there. Yes, I will go here, and then here, and then here.
So, building on that, for example of what you're talking about, say you take Norma Rae. She appeared to be acting on her own, but there was somebody from the union they were trying to get in there that was influencing her. There were other people that they drafted in and talked into wearing the pins, whatever. I mean, she was the one who took the most risk, and that was an individual risk, okay? And she lost her job, okay. The union got in, and in comparison to that, say it was someplace that was already unionized and it was a strike in a group, there's no one that has the risk that Norma Rae took. But it's still the same kind of act.
Right.
Respect. So
yes.
I'd say that would be, that's a good example of a difference. Although you're still talking about it's the same kind of subject, but in a different, context, because you have a group instead of an individual.
Well, even things like some of the case studies that I have, I look at Bree Newsom. She is one of the people I looked at, climbed the flagpole. There was a whole ground crew with her. She practiced, she had someone teach her how to climb so that she could do that. There was another person on the ground holding the rope so she didn't fall and die. So she's the one who went to jail. Like you said, she took the biggest risk. Sometimes it is, this person agrees, I will take this risk, but it is for the betterment of this group.
They know that a lot of times ahead.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they absolutely know that.
So,
Yeah.
there are those that are, there's planning behind it and not planning behind it,
Yeah, sometimes it's totally spontaneous. Like with Rosa Parks, she was tired.
Yeah.
She's like, I'm not getting up again. I'm not. I'm tired. I've worked all day. I'm tired of being told to get up out of my seat.
Straw.
And
whereas the others are a plan
yes,
of,
sometimes it's a planned action. Sometimes it's spontaneous. So yeah, there are
it
different
still
ways.
qualifies for
Yes,
coercion.
it doesn't have to be, I just came up with it right now. It's like you can decide, I am going to go into this place and I am going to protest in this way. And I will probably get arrested. And people make that choice and do that. It doesn't make it less parrhesiastic because they knew the risks going in.
Okay.
Yeah. Miti?
Yeah, so thank you so much. This is super interesting in so many ways. And so thinking about global structures, often embodied by leaders, many of them probably, some of them are, there's different levels of comfort with parrhesia coming from the population. and most of them might or may not even know the term, but Pope Francis has even used the term Parrhesia. Would you tell us a little bit about Pope Francis and Parrhesia?
Sure. Yeah, and I do. I've had a couple of people, specifically at Xavier, ask me, they're like, doesn't Pope Francis use this word? I'm like, yes, he does. And so Pope Francis, in some of his talks, has spoken about speaking with Parrhesia in very, meaning speaking boldly and straightforwardly and in service of the greater good, that we should not remain neutral, that we should always be standing up for people who are less fortunate, for the poor, and yes, so he uses Parrhesia. And it is probably his background in languages and knowledge that allows him to use that word, because very few modern speakers use Parrhesia or reference it. But of course, if you've read the Bible in Greek, you've seen it, and so that is also, it's talked about. One of the things I studied were preaching manuals and how it's dealt with in preaching manuals, like in the 18th century, 17th century. It has to be addressed because the martyrs are talked about using Parrhesia. But it's within this context of yeah, but that was then and now we'd like you to be obedient. So it's really this skewed way of looking at it. It's in the same thing with rhetorical handbooks that were from times when there was a monarchy. And so how do you deal with that? And it's Cicero was awesome, but don't do that, okay? Everybody be okay with the government. And so Pope Francis does use it and uses it in kind of that context, but he's one of the only modern speakers I've seen do that.
Do you think there's a risk in his message being misunderstood, and that this is a term that people just do not know? And we all know, people don't look up words they know, even when the professor said, look up this word.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good, sometimes he follows it up with, we need to speak with Parrhesia to speak clearly and straightforwardly and boldly about oppression in the world. So he'll follow it up. But yeah, so yes, I think there is a danger of people going, what's that word? What's that mean? So, and I don't know how it's necessarily translated into other languages where there's not a direct correlation for Parrhesia. Sometimes it's boldness. Sometimes it's courageously. Sometimes it's, libertas. Sometimes it's kentia, so it is, there are various ways that it's translated. But yeah, Pope Francis is one of the modern advocators of Parrhesia. Do you have anything to add to that? Because I feel like you're more of an expert on Pope Francis than I am. You can just, nothing? Okay. I'll go to you next, but I want Elena, go ahead.
I was wondering, does Parrhesia always come with deviance or being deviant, and does it always come with a sanction?
That's a good question too. Usually both, yes. Even in a context like ancient Athens, where Parrhesia was expected, it is a civic duty to enact Parrhesia. If you care about the polis, you will say what's right and what you think, whether anybody wants to hear about it or not. And so even in those contexts where it's considered a duty, you still had to have courage to stand up to the crowd and say, you're all wrong. And if we don't do this thing, terrible things will happen. And I have to say that even though you're all booing and throwing rotten food at me. And so there are always some consequences. Now it's, like I said, I could always do the continuum. Sometimes it's just social disapproval. But sometimes you don't necessarily have to go to jail. Sometimes it's oh my God, I wish she'd just be quiet. That would be a consequence. And other times, it's that continuum. Sometimes it's you're thrown out, you go to jail, whatever. So there is a continuum depending on what it is.
Do you have a good modern day, up to date, right now example of
Sure.
scenario?
And somebody will have to tell me her name. It was the bishop at the church.
Bishop Buddy.
Yes, yeah, who at the pulpit was this is wrong and this is oppression and I am going to say something about it even though everyone in the room is uncomfortable and I will have repercussions. I'm always watching for those things. So yeah, it's like rhetoric. Once you know what rhetoric is and you're oh, it's persuasion, it's everywhere. Parrhesia is similar to that. You start going, oh, that's Parrhesia, oh, that's Parrhesia. Or sometimes you're is that Parrhesia? And then what I have in here is well, here's how you can interrogate those moments and say, well, is this Parrhesia? Because sometimes it's just a jerk throwing bottles. Like, it's not for a greater good, it's not for, so it's not just all disruption, it's for a particular reason and in a particular context. Yeah, I'll go there and then Sheena.
You touched on this a little bit answering this question, and then you mentioned that you talk about it a little bit in your book, but I was curious by the term like speaking truth or power to truth, and then like the ambiguity of truth. Like, how do you combat the fact that like some people have their own truths and they think their truth is like in their mind is doing good, but it's actually doing harm to the most amount of people, just like thinking currently they think they're like actually doing a cause, but like using Parrhesia in like the wrong way?
That is also a really good question and a very sticky one. So what I offer in the book is basically like a heuristic of self-questioning to say, okay, maybe this is Parrhesia, let's question this. And one of the things, is it factually true? Like, is the thing they're saying factually true? And being able to hone in on, and honestly, oddly enough, this is where my background in nonviolent communication actually helps me a lot, is like looking for the value underneath the action. Well, what are they acting from? Are they acting, a lot of times it's out of fear, and that is not a valid, that is not a truth. That is not that's not a community held value. That's something else. So looking for, sometimes people have been misinformed and they believe that they are acting because, they're acting for reasons of like freedom and liberty and autonomy when they're actually being manipulated. And the thing that they are acting from is not a fact. Like, it is factually incorrect. And so that is one of the things that, that discounts it. When people are acting from a place that the thing they're acting on is not, literally not correct, then that kind of disqualifies it. But you're absolutely right, that some people, what they think of as truth it's not as clear cut as it was in ancient Athens, right? So when they were like, it's true or it's not true, end of story. And what we have now is more complicated. And so it's why I don't call it truth. It's why I say truth claims, community held values, things like that. I don't try to call it truth. But yes, that is our kind of common phrase that popularized by Foucault there of speaking truth to power. And it's a lot harder than that. And it is really that kind of interrogation of, is this really serving a community? Who's included in that community? Who's excluded from it? And if there are people excluded from it, then maybe you're not actually serving that community. So yeah, that is a complicated answer. It's a complicated answer. Like, there isn't a simple way to answer it. So I'll go Sheena, and then did you have a question too? And then I'll go Beth. Okay, Sheena.
Thank you, Renee. This is delightful. So I did my dissertation on what was called resistance literature in Israel and Palestine. So read an exhaustive list of what I assume was exhaustive in Arabic, Hebrew, and English on what feels like this topic. Was also in circles of, with classicists, right? And no one ever used Parrhesia as a term. And I can't help but feel like it's purposeful at some sense, almost like a conspiracy theory, right? Like it's not in the common lexicon, which I feel like makes us think it's not a thing that exists or that we should be doing. Do you have any thoughts on that? Sure,
yeah, absolutely. It is a little known term. When I stumbled across it, I literally stumbled across it. I was flipping through a book of rhetorical terms, and I'm like, oh, what's that? And I'm like, that's interesting. And then I started and went, oh, there's a lecture by Foucault. Oh, wow, this is it. This is everything I've always been studying this. I think some of it is the language difference. It is a term that fell out of use. Like, it exists in Greek. Right? So it's a Greek word, and when things are translated, you lose some of that meaning. Anybody who knows multiple languages knows how that translation works. And so now, instead of us having one word, now we have to say speak truth to power, and it's a little phrase, and that loses some of its oomph. And then you just don't know what it is. And sometimes I do honestly believe people don't know about it. Like, it's just a phrase they've never heard or read about. And this was especially true when I first started researching it. And then there are also, even if you know the term, like, I can tell, like, if I read a research article, I can tell which sources that person has read and which ones they have not, and which time period they're basing their definition on, because it changes. It changed over the last 3,000 years, like how it was represented. And so there is also like the way that it was represented to me, like in a rhetorical manual when I first found it, is like, what was it? It was like speaking truthfully or boldly while asking permission to do so. And I'm like, well, that's not really Parrhesia now, is it? But that's what you see, that is a manifestation of that. You even see this in plays and stuff. You know, the person goes before the king and bows and says, permission to speak freely. That's Parrhesia. And a good king will be willing to hear that critique. So it was watered down a lot culturally in different places, and sometimes seen as a rhetorical device as opposed to the actual like full of teeth Parrhesia that it can be. So I don't know that it's been intentional. I think a lot of it is just, it's a term that fell out of use. And it has only been in these last like 10 years that I see it anywhere. And people send me articles, they're like, look, somebody said Parrhesia, you know? So it is like, it's a thing now because people know that I study it. But yeah, people don't know about it. And they should, because you're right. In like resistance literature, it's like, well, it's this thing, like this is what it is, but you can't call it that. And I think that it is a loss in our discourse to not be able to call it what it is. So. Tell your friends, Parrhesia. Tell them all. Go ahead.
Do you have any recommendations for especially younger people who may want to take steps towards being more Parrhesiatic but don't know where to start or what actions to take initially?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question too. It is, some of it too is, and I'm clear about this, I was even clear about it in the part that I read, I don't want to advocate for people, like, go out, risk your lives. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But I feel like there are moments that everybody encounters. There's the person, you see the person being bullied, and you're like, oh, I should say something, but oh, I don't want to, and I don't say something. That's Parrhesia. Like, you see something wrong that's happening in the moment, call that out.
One example?
What's that? Sure.
Recently was the coach who pulled his player's hair, and the other girl on the team stepped in and blocked him.
Yes, exactly.
Not do it.
Yes. So yes, those kinds of things, they're there and they count, and they mean something, they're important.
So they don't always have to be verbal acts.
No.
Non-verbal.
That's why I showed Tank Man. Tank Man is one of my very nonverbal, and if you see the whole picture, like I talk about him in my book too, it's him, and then there's this whole line of tanks, and it is in the context of it was the day after this massacre in Tiananmen Square. And it's just this guy with his grocery bags.
Those of us that were alive when it happened, I'd say there's many people here that were not alive when that happened. It was extremely powerful to see that he was just walking and had his, I don't know what was in the bag.
Grocery bag, yeah, shopping, yeah.
And he just stopped when he crossed the street and just stood in front of the tank.
Well, in the whole, you talk about the networked theory there, the people who the journalists who took those pictures had to sneak that out of China.
Yes.
Like they also took risks to get that film out so that the world could see it. But again, that is a hugely powerful image.
That was like the risk to actually get out the information that it happened.
Exactly, and that is why those things are often tried to shut down. Why oppressive governments would try to silence or shut something like that down, because it challenges their authority. Like power is supposed to look seamless and unassailable, and there's nothing you can do. And so when somebody stands up and challenges it, especially if they walk away from it, well,
their enemy.
That just undermines like authority. So, but yeah, I think.
To show that picture. I mean, it's that image is illegal.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. It is an illegal image. So yes, but yeah, you don't have to step in front of a tank to do something Parrhesiastic, and it makes a difference. It makes a difference in in your everyday life to stand up when you see things like that and say something about it. Did you have a question?
Yeah, going back to the tank man slide, it occurred to me, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. I think that especially in our current climate, that there are definitely people who think that they can tick off all the boxes. Whether we feel, it does, to us, Parrhesia, of course, it's going to be coming from the liberal standpoint of where things are going these days, because there's people that are in power, we don't have that power, you know, I mean, but there are always going to be those people who are say that, well, I am practicing this myself. You know, the current president could say, well, I'm punching up because this structure has been in place for all these years, and I've come in and I'm disrupting the status quo, and I am trying to wreck that power that has been in place for all these years, and I am at great risk to do this because, I mean, look at what's happening to our economy. You know, I mean, there is so much going on. He can tick off every box and say, this is why I am practicing Parrhesia right now.
But not every box. And that is one of the things that I would say. This literally, this was the downfall of Athenian democracy, was mimicry of Parrhesia. It was politicians who were like, Pericles got elected 41 times for saying stuff like this, so I'm going to do that too. But they were completely like self-serving in that regard. It was to give themselves more power. But because people who do not have, and it's one of the reasons I think we need the tools to interrogate these things and to actually question them and analyze them, they don't know. They're like, well, that sounds right. And that's like putting it to the man, I guess. Like it's very straightforward, it's bold and straightforward, but it does not serve like a community. It does not serve the marginalized or oppressed. It tends to be self-serving.
We're going to bring back jobs.
We'll see.
Right. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, but there is, because I was sitting there while I was listening, and I was kind of going over those points, and I'm going, yeah, but this, and I go, well, but. And
I know.
I'm
Oh, yeah.
arguing it in
People
my
can make an
head.
argument for it. And it comes back down to like the idea of interrogations of the truth and what ethos means to people. So, all right, I will take like one more question and then I will end because the rest of you are probably exhausted and tired of listening to me talk.
I kind of have less of a question, more of a statement, but I think the kind of thing that we seem to be getting a little caught on is the key point of underlying value, where you can take something that is objectively true and two people who are seeing it from a different angle will think something differently about it, but to examine the underlying value of whether something is parrhesiastic or not, the person acting in the parrhesiastic sense has to be exhibiting a value such as equality, speaking truth, like supporting these overlying like greater good kind of ideals. And generally when we're talking about someone who is misusing Parrhesia, they don't genuinely believe that this thing will help everyone. They don't genuinely believe that whatever policy or whatever event they're supporting is going to help everyone. They know it's not going to, but they're going to say that they think it will. And so that underlying value of deception or self-servance means that that is not Parrhesia.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes, that is exactly right. All right, thank you. I'll talk to you. I'll talk to you later. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I tell you to buy my book, but don't. It's too expensive. Check it out from the library.
That would be unethical.